All right. Well, I just wanted to share something that we rejoiced in earlier this week and kind of unpack it a little bit. It's an important issue for me, ethically and spiritually, so I wanted to share some of my thoughts. So, in the past week, the Washington Supreme Court unanimously struck down the death penalty in our state. So, the Evergreen state is now abolished it, stating it as, in declaring the death penalty unconstitutional, the court cited the disproportionate role of race in capital sentencing, as well as sort of an arbitrary way in which they make these decisions based on where the crime happened and who it was and the resources. It's just very kind of hit or miss. And so there's someone who really supported this, said that black defendants in Washington are more than 5 times more likely to be sentenced to death than white defendants. So that was one of the propelling reasons why the Supreme Court struck this down. It says it's unconstitutional because it really hones in on people of color in our country. So in looking at the death penalty, I mean, in the Buddhist worldview, it is like the heaviest destructive karma that we can do. There's really no negotiating about this. It is really the first precept, whether you take the lay precepts, whether you take the anagarika, whether you take the novice ordination precepts or full ordination, killing a human being under the control of afflictions is a non-negotiable. It is a heavy karma. But in the world's terms, most countries and most institutions don't have this high of a bar on why you abolish the death penalty. They look at a lot of the research mostly about, how effective is it in deterring crime? How much does it cost? And more research is showing the many harsh drawbacks to it that people, and particularly in the United States right now, are slowly coming to look at and make some decisions about. Washington state now becomes the 20th state in the United States to abolish the death penalty. So there's somewhat of a momentum going on. So the no killing that we have, just really on deep, very, very ethical issues is one of the issues that comes up when people start proposing that we abolish this in America. But there's a number of other ones that, once again, because we have so many different perspectives and so many different worldviews in this country, a lot of these are addressing many, many perspectives, kind of gives it a very, very big picture. So to put this in perspective as far as the United States goes, there are 195 countries in the world. 140 of them have abolished the death penalty. The top 5 countries that account for 80% of the death penalty executions: China, Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and the United States. 80% of executions. So there's a wonderful article. So I went looking to, I wanted something to unpack this in my mind a little bit more about. In Psychology Today, I think it was in 2016, there was an article by Brad Bushman. I don't know whether he's a psychologist, psychiatrist, that's very, very clear about all the realities of the death penalty on lots of different levels. So he unpacked it into 8 particular points that really propose abolishing. He says, let's put to death the death penalty in this country. And these are the main reasons through his research that he's come up with. And just listen to some of them and see what you think. The first one is the death penalty models the behavior it seeks to prevent. Like, this is a no-brainer. The death penalty answers violence with violence. And as Wendell Berry, a great American novelist, said, violence breeds violence. Acts of violence committed to justice or in affirmation of rights or in the defense of peace do not end violence. They prepare and justify its continuation. All right, so just the first one across the board is killing somebody for killing somebody. Doesn't serve any purpose. The second one, which is a little bit more of a stretch, it's a lot of a stretch for me, but this makes sense to a lot of people, including some victims' families over the years, is that you might be killing the wrong person. So this was research done by the National Academy of Sciences that found that 1 in 25 people on death row are innocent. So if we've got 3,000 people incarcerated in this country, about 125 of them are innocent. Number 3, the death penalty does not reduce murder rates. And this was something that the FBI had done some research on. It says that the states with death penalty have 48 to 101% higher rates of homicide than states without the death penalty. And they've even done an international study that went over the course of 74 years. 110 countries looked at this and basically came to the same conclusion, that executions do not deter violent crimes. And one of the reasons that they say that that's true, that it does not deter criminals, is that most murders are committed in a fit of intense rage. After an intense argument, perhaps being under the control of some substance, when people rarely consider the consequences of their actions, it's not premeditated. So you can't just say, I'm going to deter crime. It's not like crime is like you steal a lot of cars. You know, it's a one-shot deal for somebody under the control of deep afflictions that commits the majority of these violent crimes. Number 4, now this is where it starts to get really specific. The death penalty targets the poor. All right, so this is Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, of which many of the appeals get that far, says that people who are well represented at trial, who have the best attorneys, do not get the death penalty. She also criticized the fact that there's very little money for public offenders, very little money for people who want to defend the poor in this country. Even O.J. Simpson's lawyer, who made $5 million defending him, admitted, if you're in the system, being guilty and rich, you're better off than being innocent and poor. There are no billionaires, there are no millionaires on death row. And there is a beautiful project right now in the United States. I'm not going to talk too much about it. It's called the Bail Project by Robert and David Steinberg out of the Bronx, who have started this whole movement of being able to supply bail for people who have been arrested, because 90% of the people in our county jails waiting for trials have not been convicted, have not been accused, have not been tried. And a lot of them plead guilty just to go home so they can pay the bills and feed their families and not lose their children. Sometimes they can't afford the $500, which is basically bail is to commit the person who has been arrested to show up in court. And so Robin and her husband have got this bail project going on. It's now going across the country that if they can supply the bail, 90% of the people go to court. 50% of them, the trials are dismissed, and only 2% of them ever get convicted. This is totally a money-making proposition by getting the poor put into this no-win situation that they can't come up with bail, and they sit in our county jails sometimes for years if they don't plead guilty to something they didn't commit. Second one is that the death penalty targets people of color. I think this is also a no-brainer. So Black Americans make up 12% of our country's population, but they account for 48% of those on death row. And if you're a Black American, the chance of you receiving a death penalty goes up about 38%. In addition, Black Americans in our juries are hard to find. They generally don't get picked. Maybe the juries, maybe the lawyers think they're going to have some predispositions to not believe what the testimony, but they sometimes are excluded from juries. The next one, which is really intense, is the death penalty may constitute cruel and unusual punishment. Now, there are 5 ways to execute somebody in this country: lethal injection, electrocution, gas chamber, firing squad, and hanging. The state of Utah still does firing squads. And the ACLU argues that there are so many problems involved in the way in which we kill people on death row. Drugs for lethal injections, which is the one that is generally used, the prisoner generally dies within 7 minutes of receiving the injections, and these drug cocktails are basically manufactured in Europe But because of the increasing pressure and legalities on European pharmaceutical manufacturers, they're getting harder and harder to find for our prison systems to use. So as a result, states have been trying experimental drug cocktails for lethal injections, just making it up as they go, mixing things. Something that's a heart stopper, something that paralyzes people, and something that's an anesthesia of some sort. Several cases, this is in 2014, they're called botched executions, and where they receive the injections, and some of these death row inmates, it took them anywhere from 1 to 2 hours to die. Going through a process of seizures, convulsions, not being able to breathe. One was even offered a pit stop in the middle of this while these drugs are taking effect. And then for those who use electrocution, even more horrible things where it's just not working. They continue to electrocute the inmate in this torturous way again and again. The heart's still beating, the body's smoking, the hair's on fire, and the heart's still beating. They just keep zapping them. And right now, Nebraska has just gotten the okay to use fentanyl, which is part of our opioid epidemic, so we know that it can kill people. But many prisons are experimenting on their death row inmates to see what kills them. I mean, just hear the ethical dilemma here. Here's another one for folks who think that the bottom line is important. That prisoners that have received the death penalty, those prisoners cost a lot more than if you were to keep them in life in prison without parole. California spent over $114 million last year beyond the cost of simply keeping the convict locked up for life. The national average is to put somebody on death row, it takes 1 to 2 times as much money, taxpayers' money, than to keep them in for life. Main reasons being that there is a requirement for appointing the death-qualified defense lawyers. There's a lot of pre- and post-trial filings by both the prosecutors and the defense. There's a lot more lengthier, complicated jury selection. And there's a 2-phase death penalty trial, more extensive, because once they get convicted, then the appeal process starts. There's a family that's been waiting 25 years for the person who murdered their family member. They've been waiting 25 years to have some resolution. So the people that are, looking at this saying, instead of put the inmates stay in prison for life without parole, and all that money the taxpayers saved can be used for the families of victims to help support their healing, to help support their legal fees or their psychiatric fees, their financial fees. If the person who got murdered was the main breadwinner of their family, to sort of compensate the families of victims. And then the one that shook me the most, and it really shows how the human heart cannot be totally unaffected by this issue, that we are so interconnected. The last one is the death penalty negatively impacts jurors, justices, governors, and the executioners. So any discussion on the death penalty should also consider the potential psychological impact of executing another human being. What does that do to the human that's involved in any part of that process? So there's out of the University of Albany, there is the Capital Jury Project, which interviewed over 1,200 jurors that partook in juries for 353 capital trials in 14 states, and found that over 80% of the female jurors and 20% of the male jurors regretted their decisions after they convicted them. And that 63% of the women and over 38% of the male jurors sought counseling after the trial. The former superintendent of the Oregon State Penitentiary said, "After each execution, I have a staff member who decides they don't want to be asked to serve on that capacity again. Others quietly seek employment elsewhere. A few told me they were having trouble sleeping, and I'm worried that they will develop PTSD if they go through another one." And this is probably the one, there's these last two here, just to really put this point through on how this affects not just the families of the incarcerated who are on death row and the families of the victims, but the whole dependent arising is deeply affected by this. So often a death row inmate requests a last-minute stay of execution, which is either granted or denied by the justices of the Supreme Court. It can go that far. We've seen that in the past few years. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg says that making this decision is the hardest part of the job she does. Forget about immigrants. Forget about gerrymandering. Forget about Roe versus Wade. This is the most difficult one she has to make a decision about. And that the last hope of a death row inmate has for a stay of execution is a grant of clemency from a governor. But we've also seen this over the years. The former governor Edmund Brown, who's Governor Jerry Brown's dad, who was a governor back in the 90s. I think he was maybe 80s. I didn't see his dates. But he's Governor Jerry Brown's dad, had to make this decision about 59 incarcerated and granted clemency to 23 of them. And this is what he said. The longer I live, the larger loom those 59 decisions about justice and mercy that I had to make as a governor. They didn't make me feel godlike then. Far from that, I felt just the opposite. It was an awesome ultimate power over the lives of others that no person or government should have or crave. And looking back over their names and the files now, despite the horrible crimes and the catalog of human weaknesses they comprise, I realized that each decision took something out of me that nothing, not my family, not my work or hope for the future, has ever been able to replace. He was profoundly, deeply altered by his decisions as a governor. That he just says it just won't go away. That the people who carry out the executions, 31% of them suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, compared to 20% of Iraqi veterans. And last but not least, this story probably just it's just so profoundly painful to read, but so important that this man was willing to share this. His name was Ron. He was a corrections officer from Florida and Texas. He says, those of us who have lived through an execution know just what the death penalty does to those who must perform it. In my tenure as a warden of both those states, I helped perform 3 electrocutions in Florida and oversaw 5 lethal injections in Texas. In both places, I saw staff traumatized by the duties they were asked to perform. Officers who never even met the condemned fought tears, cowered in corners so as not to be seen. Some of my colleagues turned to drugs and alcohol to numb the pain of knowing that a man had died by their hands. I myself was haunted by the men I was asked to execute in the name of the state of Florida. I would wake up in the middle of the night to find them lurking at the foot of my bed. One of them had been cooked to death in a botched electrocution. I had just stood 4 feet away from him, watching flames rise out of his head, hearing the electrician say, "Is that enough? Should I continue?" It wasn't until I left my post as a warden that I finally sought counseling for the trauma that I experienced. So the human heart can't take this. It just can't. The death penalty brings suffering all around, including the victims of families. Many of them say, this is one of the other misconceptions, that once an incarcerated on death row is executed, the families of the victims have closure. They say there is absolutely no truth to that. The drawn-out trials, which can last up to 25 years, just rehash the trauma over and over again. And many of these families say that believing that killing the killer makes everything okay just doesn't work for them. A number of the family members have even testified on trial and asked that the defendant who murdered their loved ones not be executed. So suffering all around. So I rejoice in Washington State's Supreme Court decision, and I hope that more states move in this direction, and that we as the citizens of the United States can encourage and support this profound need to change our hearts about this. We can petition, we can really support organizations that oppose the death penalty, get it on the state ballot, which is where it started in Washington State. And as we have heard from Venerable Jigme and Venerable Tarp and Venerable Church, and many of us who, connect with the incarcerated, that many of them make profound life changes as a result of being in prison. Their minds are transformed. They develop a huge sense of regret. They turn their minds and their lives around in really profound ways so that we never give up on them. And so I want to end with just one of the great quotes of the Buddha, which is, "Hate does not cease hatred, but only by love. This is the eternal rule." So may we be able to create the cause and conditions to support the abolition of the death penalty in the United States of America.